Who was Marco Polo? By Joan Holub, illustrated by John O'Brien. Who was Marco Polo? Marco Polo lived in Venice, Italy, more than 750 years ago. Back then, in the 1200s, most people spent their whole lives right where they were born. But not Marco. He made an 11,000-mile trip to China and back. And he became the most famous traveler in Europe. Not just because he made such a long and dangerous trip, although hardly anyone else in Europe had done this at the time, but because he wrote a book about his adventure. Like his father and uncle, Marco was a merchant. The Polos wanted to go to Asia to bring back silk, spices, and other expensive goods to sell in Europe. Marco was a teenager when he went off to China. He didn't return to Italy for 24 years. China's ruler was named Kublai Khan, Khan. He liked Marco and sent him to nearby countries to spy. Marco took notes about the places he saw and the customs of the people he met. He used these notes to write a book about his travels. Reading his book was the way many Europeans learned about Asia. 200 years later, explorers such as Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama read Marco's book. It made them want to reach Asia, too. But they hoped to find an easier route. Was everything in Marco's book true? Historians think he exaggerated here and there. Some even think he never went to China at all. Still, his book made him famous around the world. What is the true story of Marco Polo? Chapter 1. A family of merchants. Two things made the year 1254 important in Marco Polo's life. First, it was the year he was born. And second, it was the year his father, who was named Niccolo, and his uncle Maffeo left Venice on a trading trip to Asia. Marco's father was gone so long that Marco was 15 years old when they met for the first time. Soon after Marco was born, his mother died. He was sent to live with relatives. As a boy, he didn't spend much time in school. Instead, his family taught him things he needed to know to become a merchant. For instance, Venetians used coins such as silver grossos and gold ducats, ducats. Marco needed to know how to weigh the coins correctly. Venetians had their own measuring system. It was based on using their hands and feet. For instance, one palm was about 9.5 inches. Cloth would have been measured in palms. Other countries used different kinds of money and measurements. Marco needed to learn about them, too. Otherwise, merchants could cheat him. The sailors and merchants Marco met on Venice's docks also taught him about trading. Venice was the most powerful trading city in the world. Its busy port, with ships constantly coming and going, was on the Adriatic Sea. Venice was not like most cities. It was actually a group of 118 tiny islands connected by canals. Marco and his family traveled the canals in long canoe-like boats called gondolas, gondolas. Back then Italy was not a country. It was a group of city-states. Each city-state ruled itself. Venice was one of the largest, with as many as 100,000 people. Venice sold its products wood, wheat, and salt to foreign lands. Salt was very valuable in those days. And lots of it washed up on Venice's shores. Since there were no refrigerators, salt was used to keep fish and meat from rotting. Without salt, they rotted within a week. But salted, these foods could last for months. This was very important on long trips at sea. While Marco was growing up, his father and uncle kept traveling. By 1260, they were in Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, Turkey. There, they traded the goods they brought from Venice. They were paid in jewels. After crossing the Black Sea, they traveled eastward along the Volga River. In the trading city of Bulgaria, they visited a Mongol ruler named Berk Khan. The word Khan means ruler. In return for their jewels, Berk gave the Polos goods worth twice as much. Things were going well. Unfortunately, a war began between Berk and another Mongol ruler named Hulagu. Both were grandsons of a warlord named Genghis Khan, who had died over 30 years earlier. The Polos were ready to return home. But the route back to Venice was blocked by the war. Since they couldn't go west, they decided to go east to the city of Bokhara, Uzbekistan. They were trapped there for 3 years. Then in 1265, Hulagu sent some messengers to China to visit his brother, Kublai Khan. Kublai and the other Khans came from the area marked in stripes on the map Mongolia. The people of Mongolia were called Mongols. The Mongol Empire was much bigger than Mongolia is today. The striped area shows how big it was by 1259. Hulagu's messengers met the Polos and invited them to go along. The Polos agreed. This was a brave decision. Few Europeans had ever been to China, which they called Cathay. Back then, they thought there were only 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. They believed that China was at the far end of the world. Bandits, wars, slow transportation, and bad roads made it dangerous to reach. It took the Polos and the messengers over a year to reach Kublai Khan's palace in the Mongol capital, now Beijing, China. Niccolo and Mafio were some of the very first Europeans Kublai had ever met. When they arrived at his court, he welcomed them and asked questions about Europe. Eventually Kublai asked them to take a message to the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church in Rome. In those days, the Pope was also a powerful political leader. The Polos were to ask for 2 things: 1, 100 Catholic priests who had studied math, astronomy, and other subjects; 2, some holy oil that came from a special church in Jerusalem. The holy oil was rumored to have special powers, which the Khan probably hoped to use against enemies. Kublai wanted the Polos to return to China with these things. He said that if the priests could prove Christianity was the best religion of all, he might even become a Christian himself. Did he really mean it? It's true Kublai was interested in learning about different religions. But it's also possible he hoped the missionaries would help him figure out how to gain power over Christian lands. The Polos said they would return with the things Kublai had asked for. They left China and headed home. If you lived in Europe at the time of Marco Polo, you were probably a poor, hard-working peasant. Even children worked instead of going to school. People often got married when they were teenagers. You stunk because you didn't take a bath very often. When you did bathe, you might bathe outdoors in a stream or pay to take a bath at a bathhouse. If you were lucky, you had soap. You used sticks or rags as a toothbrush. Forget about toothpaste, you probably didn't know how to read or write. Your toilet was a special pot. It didn't flush. Your toilet paper was hay, sticks, or whatever was handy. When your pot got full, you dumped the stinky stuff in the street along with other garbage. If you lived in Venice, you dumped it in the canal. You probably didn't live in a big city like Marco did. You lived in a small town or in the country. Your house was made of wood, straw, mud brick, or plaster. If you were rich, it was stone. Chapter 2. Marco leaves home. By the time the Polos returned to Italy in 1269, the Pope had died. They waited and waited for another Pope to be chosen. 2 years later, in the spring of 1271, they decided to quit waiting and head back to China. Marco was 17 now. He wanted to go to China, too. He didn't want to be left behind. His father and uncle knew the trip would be dangerous. Still, they agreed to take him along. They sailed from Venice into the Adriatic Sea and then south to the Mediterranean Sea. In those days, sailors believed there were giant monsters in the sea. Maybe Niccolo thought his son would get scared and want to turn back. But Marco never did. Their first stop was the city of Acre, then on to Jerusalem. To Christians, Jews, and Muslims, Jerusalem is a holy city. Important events in each religion took place there. Jesus lived and died in Jerusalem. King Solomon built the first Jewish temple there. And the Islamic prophet Muhammad rose to heaven in Jerusalem. Ownership of Jerusalem has changed many times over the centuries. In 1099, armies of Christian knights conquered the city during military campaigns called the Crusades. Then in 1187, Muslims gained control of the city. Jerusalem was still under Muslim rule when the Polos stopped there and took a sample of the special oil from the church. Afterward, they set out for China. They hadn't gone far when they heard that a new pope had finally been chosen. Luckily, he was nearby, in Acre. The Polos went and told him of the Khan's request for 100 priests. The new pope listened. He decided to send some expensive presents such as crystal. But he would send only 2 friars instead of priests. In a letter to the Khan, the Pope explained that the 2 friars would train Kublai's men to become priests. Then the new Mongol and Chinese priests could teach others about Christianity. Would this change make Kublai Khan mad? The Polos hoped not. They needed the Khan's friendship in order to make sure no one in his empire harmed them. That way, they could buy Chinese goods and safely bring them all the way back to Europe. In China, they not only planned to get silks, but they wanted to bring back porcelain, too. Porcelain is a kind of pottery that is made from special white clay and painted with beautiful designs. To China by land and sea. In Marco Polo's day, there were 2 main ways to get to East Asia from Europe, the Silk Road and the Spice Route. Neither way was easy. The Silk Road was about 5,000 miles long, mostly overland. The Spice Route was mostly by sea. Each was named for the things Europeans wanted most from Asia, silk and spices. A trader usually only traveled partway on these routes. When he reached a city, he sold his goods, wood, for example, to another merchant there. That merchant took the wood farther along the route to another city, where it was sold again. The goods changed hands many times before reaching China, where the wood was traded for silks and spices. At this point, the return trip began. Both coming and going, each trader charged a little more for the resold goods. After all, they wanted to make a profit. By the time the goods got to the end of the journey, they cost much more than when they started out. In other parts of Kublai's empire, the Polos hoped to find diamonds, rubies, and pearls. In Turkey, they would buy lovely carpets. They wanted spices such as nutmeg, cinnamon, and pepper from India and the Spice Islands, now called Indonesia. Back home, they could sell everything and get rich. In November of 1271, the Polos and the 2 friars set off for China again. First, they sailed north in the Mediterranean Sea. When they tried to land in Armenia, they ran into trouble. Egyptians were attacking it. The 2 friars got scared. The trip had barely begun and already there was danger. So they turned back. The Polos continued on. But now all they had was holy oil to take to the Khan. The silk secret. The Chinese made beautiful clothes out of silk fabric. Designs were sewn on the silk with brightly colored thread. They were works of art. For thousands of years, silk producers in China kept their ways of making silk a secret. Eventually, their secret got out. Here's how silk is made. 1. Silkworm moths lay eggs. 2. After 10 days, the eggs hatch into small caterpillars called silkworms. 3. The silkworms eat mulberry leaves. 4. When a silkworm is about 1 month old, it shoots a stream of liquid from its mouth. This hardens into a strand of silk. The worm wraps the strand around itself, creating a cocoon. The cocoon is made of a single thread that can be a half-mile long. 5. Silk workers drop the cocoons into boiling water to kill the pupa. Otherwise, the moth pupa might bite its way out of the cocoon and break the silk strand. Boiling also makes the silk soft and easy to unwind. 6. The cocoons are unwound by hand. 7. 3 or more strands of silk are twisted together to make one strong thread. 8. The threads are woven into silk cloth and then dyed bright colors. Chapter 3. The Long Trip to China. On the way to China, Marco saw sights that seemed very strange to him. He wrote about them in journals. Because he was a merchant, he paid special attention to the products of each area. He also noted any dangers and whether food and water were